All right. Thank you for the songs. We'll be returning to Hebrews chapter 11. In our series through Hebrews, this is message number 34, entitled Worship, Walk, Work. So we're going to be in Hebrews chapter 11. We'll be looking at verses 4 to 7. By faith, Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony that he pleased God. But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of them that diligently seek him. By faith Noah, being warned of God of things not seen here, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world, became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. So Hebrews chapter 11 is one of the most well-known chapters in the Bible. It may well also be one of the chapters most often taken out of context, as it is turned to with no consideration of what the rest of this letter is about before or after. But we want to know things like, why did he include this material? Why did he pick the particular examples that he did? And what does this chapter have to do with his readers and their situation? Again, these are all things that we need to know to understand these books. The writer, from the beginning of this letter all the way through to the end, exhorts the readers to hold on to their faith. And so what is it that prompted this exhortation? And the writer, and keep using that word, the writer uses that word in chapter 13 and verse 22. He refers to this letter as an exhortation. And that word, the word for exhortation, means encouragement, and it has the idea of a stirring instruction. In other words, you might call it inspiring and persuasive as far as style. His readers have a profession of faith, but they're facing increasing persecution, and he's warning them against apostasy, turning back from Jesus Christ, going back to the old covenant. So he's saying, hold on, hold fast to your faith, don't forsake Christ and faith in him, to turn back to works, in essence. He also urged them to follow after others, those that had gone before them and had gone before in faith, and they had endured, and because of the hope that they had in God's promises. So now this last section of this letter turns to the examples and illustrations, practical instructions for them to persevere, to endure, to keep on believing. Verses 1 to 3 open with a definition, a description of faith. And, excuse me, he casts faith in light of history, those things in the past, in terms of the present, and even into the future as he comes into the then present time and looking forward. So he sets up this continuity of faith from before the old covenant all the way through the new. And the writer establishes that pleasing God, which is an important concept in this chapter in particular, pleasing God has always been by faith. And he starts again from the very beginning to illustrate that fact. So for his readers, turning back from Jesus Christ and the new covenant to turn back to the old covenant, well, that's not by faith. That would actually be the opposite. It would be apostasy. Well, verses 4 to 7 give us the first set of examples that we encounter in this chapter. And so after he has spoken of our knowledge of the creation by faith, the writer proceeds to these human examples, Abel and Cain and Enoch and Noah and the world. So some of those are positive and some of those are negative. But in the cases of Abel and Enoch and Noah, these first three that he looks at, they were accepted by God, or they pleased God, and they did so by faith. So that's what we want to look at, pleasing God by faith. Beginning here again with verse number 4. By faith Abel offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, by which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and by it he being dead yet speaketh. So the writer begins with Cain and Abel. And of course, as you're reading through Genesis, this is Genesis chapter number 4. Cain and Abel were born, and they were born, according to the record, after the fall into sin. They were born sinners. And in this regard, they are just like everyone born to Adam and Eve, even down to us today, born sinners. Now, the account comes from Genesis chapter 4, particularly verses 1 to 16. And the writer focuses on verses 3 to 5 and also on verse number 10 and what he refers to here. So Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 to 5 say, And in the process of time, it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel, he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And then later, after that he had killed his brother Abel, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, and he said, What hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. Now, the writer of Hebrews here says that Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice than Cain. And the word for more excellent, it is a comparative term. So he is saying that Abel brought a better sacrifice than Cain did. So we look at the account in Genesis 4, and Cain brought an offering that could have been a vegetable offering, a grain offering, something from his farming, the fruits of the ground. Abel brought a firstling of the flock, a lamb or a goat, as that he was a shepherd. And many people assume that the problem was that Abel brought the right sacrifice and Cain brought the wrong sacrifice. Now, we have to think that this was long before the Old Covenant, long before the sacrificial system was ever established. And there is no indication anywhere in the Bible that God had commanded Cain and Abel to bring an animal sacrifice. That's just not there. And the word, in fact, that's used for offering that describes what Cain and Abel brought back in Genesis 4, the word for offering in that account means gift or tribute. And it's actually a word that was used later under the Old Covenant and the sacrificial system to describe what are referred to as free will offerings. These were voluntary offerings of worship, and most often they were grain offerings, something of that sort. They could include animal offerings, but really the key distinction about them was the fact that they were voluntary and not commanded. And being voluntary offerings also meant they were not sacrifices for sin. So in other words, there's really nothing here to tell us that God had instructed both Abel and Cain to bring a blood sacrifice, and Abel obeyed and brought a blood sacrifice, and Cain disobeyed and did not bring a blood sacrifice. Well, this offering that Abel and Cain made, again, it was a free will offering. It was not an offering for atonement. It was not a sin offering. And the writer has already referred to the fact. Think about this as well. The writer of Hebrews has already referred to the fact that the blood of animals could not take away sin. In other words, the blood of animals sacrificed could not satisfy God. He talked about that back in chapter 10 in verses 1 to 4. And notice also the writer here in verse number 4 speaks of God testifying of Abel's gifts. And he does use that word gifts. And he uses that word in chapter 5 and verse 1, and in chapter 8 and verse 3, and chapter 9 and verse 9, and every one of those instances, he uses that gifts in a distinction between offerings and sacrifices for sins. And the word that he uses for what Abel brought is offering, gifts, just the same as the Old Testament. And the word sacrifice that is used there is an indication that it was slain. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was a sacrifice for sin. So to say that Abel was accepted because he did it right and Cain wasn't accepted because he did it wrong is exactly opposite of the point that the writer is making in this entire chapter. He tells us very plainly that Abel's offering was better. Why? Because it was by faith, and Cain's was not. And when you go back and read Genesis chapter 4, it's plain that Cain's was not, and the description of sin and all those things that happens in the broader story with Cain after that he murders his brother. Not only was his offering brought by faith, but he's also telling us here in verse number 4 that Abel was declared righteous by faith. He was, in the language that he puts it here, he obtained witness, meaning witness from God, that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts. Abel was declared righteous. Now, that is also the exact point that Paul makes when he uses Abraham as an example. And the writer of Hebrews is going to use Abraham in a large way as well later. He believed in the Lord and he counted it to him for righteousness. And that is exactly the same thing that we are seeing spoken of Abel. Abel was righteous by faith and he died as a martyr. And he says to us that he still speaks today. And that's seen immediately after his death in Genesis 4:10, where his blood was crying from the ground. In other words, the implication there is, both when you study the broader story with Cain and the fact that he's guilty, he's blood guilty before the Lord because he has murdered his brother. And it was indeed a murder. Abel wasn't in any way guilty or deserving of that, what he received from his brother. So in a way of speaking, you could say that Abel was innocent and he was slain by his brother. So Abel suffered persecution, even death, martyrdom for his faith. But that death did not separate him from God. It testified of his faith and his righteousness by faith. So the point that the writer is making here is that God was pleased with Abel's offering, but not on its own merit. He was pleased with Abel's offering because he brought it by faith. And by faith, Abel was counted righteous. And so the implication is that, that he believed in God and the promised seed of the woman who would crush the head of the serpent. And just as it's of Abraham, as Abraham was counted righteous because he believed the Lord. He was justified by faith, which is what Paul said of this. This is the same point that the writer of Hebrews is here making concerning Abel. Well, then he proceeds in verse number 5. By faith, Enoch was translated that he should not see death and was not found because God had translated him. For before his translation, he had this testimony that he pleased God. So the writer proceeds to Enoch. This is the account in Genesis chapter 5 and verses 18 to 24. And Jared lived 162 years, and he begat Enoch. And Jared lived after he begat Enoch 800 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. And Enoch lived 65 years and begat Methuselah. And Enoch walked with God after he begat Methuselah 300 years and begat sons and daughters. And all the days of Enoch were 365 years. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now, in Genesis, this account, you notice there's a repetition. There's an emphasis there that Enoch walked with God. And this is a thing that was said later of Noah, that he walked with God. And the writer